Hello. Tonight I'm sitting down making a video about standing up, and I'll explain a little bit why. I've been thinking about, what it means to stand up for something, perhaps an opinion, a way of life, faith, way of reasoning, the choices you make, standing up for other people, or standing up for an alternative. Because we all make choices, and if we can't make choices, then we are in some sense doomed to end up in a place that we did not really want to end up in, perhaps. And with alternatives, if you think about it as a one-dimensional spectrum, there are those who has no alternatives, and there are those who can produce endless of alternatives. So I ask myself, to what extent can I produce an alternative? And ask you, to what extent can you produce an alternative? And why is it so important to be able to produce one and withhold it? Because we must realize that there will be many people that we meet in our lives that would perhaps prefer if we did not have alternatives. Let's say you're a very good worker and your boss is very fond of what you produce. And unless you have some kind of, emotional relationship and it's pure work, that boss would probably like you to do not produce too many alternatives to what the boss has in mind for you, unless you are by yourself producing very good alternatives for both of you. Imagine you're in a relationship and perhaps your partner is abusive to you. He or she, dominates you in the emotional sense. There are plenty of people that end up dead in relationships because they could not produce an alternative to what they were experiencing. Of course, there's always the leader, perhaps in a war, that needs you to not have an alternative to pick up the gun or sword. There are perhaps leaders in a political sense that would like you not to have an alternative to what they are offering. But there is always an alternative to everything, and it's coming from where we are coming from. and it's always present, and it's one that we always seem to return to. Because this alternative, it always offers us what we need, and it seldom lies to us, at least if we can perceive it in some kind of natural sense. And this alternative always seems to have something to offer. And this alternative would be, well, Mother Nature perhaps, is a way to put it. Because it's where we come from, it's where we can relate to, and it's available to everyone. It's for free, as long as you breathe. So this alternative, where we can observe nature and all the happenings and all the animals and their behavior, we can reason within the realm of nature to find answers and perhaps the seeds to alternatives. And when we look around today, at least in my kind of society, it seems to me that there are so many people that don't want you to have an alternative to what you see them offering. And I know I go about a lot about politicians and religious leaders, and I think they can take it. So if I were a politician and I would, deep down into the structure of society, and I walked the path for 20 years into that kind of hierarchy. I depend upon it, need my income from that kind of work. My friends are there. All of the people around me perceive me as that kind of person in that situation. So I don't have a lot of alternatives were I to be such a person. And in some sense it seems that if I don't have a lot of alternatives, then I will not offer a lot of alternatives for the people I'm dependent upon. And if that kind of situation appears, that the people that have power and influence, and perhaps the economical assets, the goods, material wealth, if they don't have many alternatives, they will not offer you many alternatives, not in a bigger sense at least. Maybe they will offer you, small pieces of alternatives. They will offer you, one big box, and within that box perhaps a few smaller boxes, and within one of those boxes you can choose from if you want a red piece of paper or a blue piece of paper. And if you're creative and very motivated, perhaps you can make those alternatives seem like they make the difference of the world. Or perhaps if you are the audience, the target of that person, if you don't get a lot of other alternative sources of information or instructions, then it might also seem as well as you have the difference of the world to choose from. So, going back to nature a bit, and this kind of, political system that a society develops over time, that system is, far from what we would call nature, it would not perhaps be easy to parse what's said and done, and to translate it into natural behavior in some sort. And you might have noticed, if you have been watching politicians speak and act, that they have this kind of special way to go about their things. For starters, a politician in this time and day will avoid at all cost to enter discussion or a question that regards perhaps a mistake of theirs, or false reasoning, and they will not answer this kind of question straight ahead, because when such a question appears to them, what it seems to be for them is, this is an opening to reveal weakness in me. And if I reveal weakness, then perhaps there are better leaders right now. And if I want to admit that I have lied or made decisions that were not what I said they would be, it's very natural for me to avoid those kind of situations. At least if my income and respect from the people around me is dependent upon it. And if I'm dependent on you, taking me as a person to look up to and to perhaps vote for, it's not a situation you want to enable, to so to say. So that kind of politician, I don't know, perhaps subconsciously will try to draw attention away from nature, in some sense, away from what is out there for everyone to perceive in a natural way. This kind of politician or religious leader will instead want you to go into the abstract. They will want to perhaps shape and form the self-image of the receiver of the message. So let's just try to paint up some example. If I'm a politician and I can speak to, a farmer that has no formal education, that is self-sufficient, that farmer can either catch or produce their own food. Or I can talk to a person living in a big city in the middle of it and goes to a shopping mall for their food. I think it would be natural in some way that it would be easier to get the person in that city environment to oblige to my needs, because that person is further away from the natural state of being, because that person is dependent upon the same kind of system that I as the politician work within. And the farmer will by him or herself be able to produce an alternative to what I say, because I could say, I'm gonna forbid you to create food, I'm gonna forbid you to get the fish, I'm gonna forbid you to cut down the trees, I'm gonna forbid you to travel over the lands, I'm gonna forbid you to trade goods with others. And in that scenario, that farmer will have to produce, a different kind of alternative. But in some sense, the politician already has that kind of power over the person in the city, unless that person has, contacts or skills that are required to, get the food and everything by themselves. So the politician will perhaps again subconsciously try to degrade the self-sufficient person and try to charm the dependent one. And it's not that it's a bad thing to live in a big city and rely on a lot of other people for your daily life and routine and future plans. It's just that if that person in their mind cannot create or imagine a scenario where they once again become self-sufficient, well, perhaps then they are doomed to oblige to what the politician will offer them. So I think we must be very wary when we notice that the freedom of a self-sufficient individual is taken away. It might not be obvious for a person living in the city. Let's say the farmer person, produce perhaps meat and wheat and what other things you need. And the city person then picks those up in the store. So they rely on each other. But if the individual, producing food and goods, materials, if they are, being attacked in the sense of being self-sufficient, it's very easy to separate those people from each other, because the person in a high technology society will perhaps not have natural bonds with the producer of the goods. So if we notice our politicians say that we have to, regulate, make laws, restrict the countryside perhaps, and that kind of environment that we depend upon, I think we should take a step back and look over the situation and ask ourselves, why is this the most important thing to talk about? And I'm not going to go into details too much because I like to keep my videos, kind of abstract for the viewer to fill up the gaps with what they can imagine themselves, because I don't think I have any answers that are ultimate, but I think, the reasoning is something that can be applied to anyone. So the politician that has no alternative reflects upon the citizen that they have no alternatives. And they will try to separate them from, the natural origin in some sense. And to remove the possibility to create alternatives. So, nature again, if we go into nature by ourselves, hear all the sounds, see all the colors, how the lives interact, there's always something there for us. Wherever we look, there's something that we can learn. And if we look at ourselves and what we do and what we are able to do, what we have talents for, you can also kind of, imagine where this comes from, because it's obvious that we all have different kind of skills, ways of adaptation, and I assume because throughout time, as civilization started, and we started specializing, dividing into roles of society, we have over time also either kept or developed or perhaps through not through but gotten rid of some aspects of our beings. Some of us have good sight, some of us are naturally very strong, some of us are tall, some of us have lots of hair on our bodies, some of us have thick bones, thick skin. Some of us have thin hair. We have different kind of facial structures. And these kind of things are not very welcome to talk about, but they're always there, and they seem to always remain because they have a natural origin in some sense. So over time I assume that those with physical capabilities and good hearing, good eyesight, we've always been keen to use them, perhaps as a hunter, in a more kind of predatory sense. And for those lacking in those departments, perhaps they developed alternatives. To fit in, fill a role, be accepted, thrive, excel, or to even take advantage of their situation in the best way possible. And I'm gonna follow now by trying to make some examples of things that are very important still today, but perhaps they are very important in a different manner than what they used to be. And I will try to imagine why those abilities are such high price today. So, starting with something that I have a little bit of experience of, acting and putting up a show. Why are actors so successful? Why are they so beloved? Why do we put on the TV or the computer or the telephone to watch them act? Well, to me it appears as, this comes from the ability to understand and mimic human emotion, and well, it's a very basic function, because if I observe someone doing something, then I can in some grade mimic that activity. And before spoken language, before written language, there was only observing. And if you were left up with only being able to observe it's a harsh word perhaps, but weak individuals or unsuccessful individuals, and that was where you could draw your inspiration from, you will also, unless you yourself add to that, produce similar outcomes. But if you find, or if you're accepted by an individual or person that is very talented and successful at what they're doing, and you observe that, you take it to heart, and you mimic it, you practice, then chances are that you will also excel at that. And over time, if a group of people have, the capabilities to excel in, well, let's say hunting, that group will also cultivate, the art of hunting. And it will cultivate it in such a way that I would be able to call it a natural cultivation, because it will naturally lead to a better outcome for the group. So that's just imagining going back to the roots of acting. So actors have that quality. They excel at observing people's emotions and also mimicking them and being able to engage others in those emotions. And today, when I get the chance to glance upon a TV show, when I was younger, perhaps 15 years ago, there were not so many shows to choose from, at least on the television at my home. But today, it seems like there are, a throng of different shows to choose from, a plethora of different actors to watch. And I don't watch TV, well, not to a great extent at least. But when I see the TV shows today, I think to myself that these kind of shows, they're very, not all, but many of them seem to me very shallow. It seems like trying to fill some kind of role or purpose in that kind of industry. So I take it as a sign that the industry is going very well, because there are room for such productions where, well, at least to me, it seems like the actors and the shows and the narratives and the stories they're telling, seems like it's a cheap copy of something, or perhaps, a meme of a production. The set doesn't seem very, live. The responses and the phrases seem somewhat tired and unmotivated. But there are also, the very successful shows like Game of Thrones, and well, I can't think of one now, but there are at least 4 or 5 more I can name if I had thought about it. And those shows are, so engaging and they're so emotionally talented, combined with a very intriguing manuscript. That it seems that the manuscripts and the individuals in some way, strictly or directly relate to everyone's reality. I'm not going to go much deeper into that, but actors, they're very successful, and many people want to be some kind of actor or entertainer. I'm just going to end with one note, that if the references we obtain or get to know, if they don't reflect some kind of natural reality, what really do they add to us? I wonder. Next example, music. Seems that that's something that all of us all around the globe seem to enjoy and seem to go about developing skills in, either by classical instruments or by voice or by computerized, and trying to imagine the natural origin of this behavior. To me at least, it would seem, if I imagine myself a few 100,000 years ago, where I'm now, what would be the sounds that I would be interested in? Well, for sure I would be interested in the sounds from nature, the animal sounds and their meaning, sounds of thunderstorms, sounds of the wind, and the sounds of other human beings. Because I imagine back then there would not be as many sounds as we have today. Because today we have endless of different sounds. And back then, I imagine if I heard a new sound or a sound that I could not place in my head, I would be particularly interested in that sound and the origin of it. So it seems to me it's very natural to be interested in sounds, no matter if they're a musical composition or there's just a sound. And as a human, I think I would always recognize the sounds of my family, my father and my mother and my siblings, because those sounds would be so important to me. And today I ask myself, if you put on the radio daytime, what kind of sounds do you hear coming from that? All the commercials, the speakers trying to speak to you in such a manner that you would be engaged listening to them. Coming up with new phrases, perhaps new tonalities, I think it's called. Commercials would be looking to produce sounds that perhaps instills some kind of emotion in you, or perhaps a sound that would make you go, "Oh, what's this kind of sound? This sound might be, very interesting for me." If you imagine that a long time ago the sounds were very important to a human being, it's not hard to thread on that reasoning. And last two examples we'll bring up is, physical power. It's something that's very natural to both respect and to want to obtain, and also sexuality. And by that I mean, the ability to express sexuality in a natural way. And what a natural way is, I will not go into, because I think it would be very hard to imagine what that would be, and I think it would be, or lead to, some kind of harsh conclusions. But both sexuality, physical, not only power but physical appearance, those are two factors that are kind of like a passive respect boost. Because if you're in a room with a lot of people and a person enters the room and visually you see that that person is, very physically powerful, it's like a trigger in your head that says, this person can, if they wanted, enforce their will on me physically. And it's a very, fatal realization, because it's a threat to your comfort and security. What if that person has, a kind of will that, well, it doesn't go very well with your own will? In your mind, you have to produce an alternative to, obliging to that person's possible will. And the same thing goes with, attractiveness or visual sexual appearance or behavior. Same kind of room, you are there with a lot of people and a person enters that is visually and obviously signaling, some kind of raw sexuality. It will have an impact on the room, and the impact can be very consequential. And if we want to take some extremes, for example, in the fundamental parts of Islam, you or the females cover themselves to, at least in my mind, not be able to express, their kind of sexuality, and therefore not being able to not being able to get the surroundings to react to that expression. Seems logical to me, at least, because it's a very powerful force. So let's see. We talked about acting, talked about music, talked about, physical appearance and power, talked about sexual appearance and behavior. And let's just take one small example also with the sexual behavior. If the person entering the room, expresses, sexuality in such a way that it would attract and engage others, perhaps, the person that you have in mind as a partner would be influenced. And in your mind, once again, you will think of an alternative to not be able or not to have to oblige with that expressed sexuality that would perhaps in some situation be a threat to your kind of future. Well, anyway, so acting, music, physical appearance and power, sexual expression and behavior. What's the combination? So that's a good looking, it's a strong, sexual person that is in control of their voice. And being in control of your voice is also a very important, skill to have. Imagine yourself being in a dangerous situation, or a situation of distress, panic, or a situation that calls for action in some way. If you can call for action with either your voice or your body, how would you call for action? It's a very, basic and natural need for a human being to be able to call to action by voice or by body language. And that's a talent also that actors have. It's perhaps not a talent that, some kind of financial revisor would be in need of. A politician would, of course, need a powerful voice and, tied together with their reasoning and emotional expressions. But if you don't have that ability or the possibility to engage by voice, then you have to have an alternative. So, I'm hoping at least that if you're watching and you listen to the examples now and you would say to me, oh well, that seems really shallow for you to, focus on those aspects. I think you're missing something. And that's true, of course. So we also need, our intellect, the mind. But I think the mind is separated from those other aspects of our physical being. Because the mind or the intellect, it gets to work when we need to find an alternative to those other needs or skills perhaps. So if you're in a situation where you're physically weaker than everyone else and your whole life depends on your physical strength, you'll have to think of an alternative to handle the situation and your life. So the mind is the kind of creator of alternatives. And the creator of alternatives thrives off on the creator of ourselves, nature. So when you find yourself, using your mind, in a very I'm losing my words here. If you're using your mind in an obsessive manner, perhaps, I think that would be a good sign that you are in some way lacking, or at least that you feel like you're lacking capabilities that you need in your kind of situation. So if your boss is being bossy with you, or your coworkers are being bossy with you, perhaps you will start to think about how to create an alternative to the situation. Perhaps your job sucks. Perhaps then you will have to create or imagine a way to create another kind of situation where you have another kind of job or another aspect of your job. Or perhaps in society at large, you find yourself in a situation where your capabilities are not wanted, pushed away, not needed, and you are still certain that your capabilities are, good in such a way that they should be kept going. You have to think about finding or creating an alternative. And what does it take to create, maintain, and withhold an alternative? In the political arena, with the political leader that is dependent upon the whole system that you're trying to change, work within, live in, create their future in. Well, it takes a very strong will, I would say. At least if you're not in that kind of game. For an ordinary kind of person with a daytime job, perhaps a family, I would say it would be like, climbing the highest mountain on earth to produce and withhold a whole new alternative to what is being said and done. And I don't know, just to end this in some kind of good way. When you see people around you, trying to create alternatives, imagine new ways of thinking, new ways of being, living, don't be too harsh on them, because it's not so easy. And perhaps you would be better off in the future if that kind of alternative were to grow out, find its place, find its people. You never know. So I say, to whatever you hear and read, get told, always try to think of an alternative to it. Because if your view of life is solid in, the outermost parts of it, the big box, the big box is cemented, you can only choose from changing the smaller box inside. And I say that you can still have the big box, can keep it and live with that box. But at the same time, you can also be open to alternatives, because it's always possible to have an alternative. And I think if we don't create or imagine or let others imagine alternatives, it would be harder and harder for us to replace the big boxes. And one thing that got me thinking about this a lot lately here in Sweden is, perhaps you've heard of it, I'm not gonna tell names, but we have some kind of green movement here now, and we have some poster people for that movement that are being spread out by media. And those kind of persons, they say they're offering an alternative, but to me it seems that that alternative offers not so many alternatives away from that. And I also think that the alternative that they are pushing also opens up for restrictions and regulations that will close alternatives for a lot of people, that a lot of people depend upon. And it might not be obvious for us to see or realize what these kind of restrictions and regulations would lead to in the long run. So this was my attempt once again to create alternatives. And yeah, always try to imagine an alternative. Even if you are, very strong in your faith, in your beliefs, you always have to, give yourself the opportunity or option to imagine an alternative. That way, perhaps you will really find what you want to stand for. Thanks for listening.